A cop stops a black woman in public, convinced she's a threat. He yells, escalates the situation, and tries to assert his authority, believing he's in control. But when she effortlessly evades his grip and calmly tells him, "You have no idea who you're messing with," everything changes. The crowd watches in shock as she reveals her true identity, a highly decorated Navy SEAL. The officer's confidence crumbles as his superior arrives, instantly recognizing her. The tables turn, and the cop realizes he just made the biggest mistake of his career. As she walks away, her final words leave him frozen in place. Never assume you know who you're dealing with. The bustling city street was alive with movement. Shoppers weaving through stores, street performers drawing small crowds, the steady hum of traffic blending with the distant honks of impatient drivers. It was an ordinary afternoon, until a sudden commotion near a storefront broke the rhythm of the day. Officer Ryan McAllister, a stocky, hot-tempered cop with a history of throwing his weight around, had locked his gaze on a black woman standing near the curb. His eyes narrowed as he strode toward her, his presence loud and confrontational. "Hey, you, stop right there!" His voice cut through the noise, demanding immediate obedience. The woman, dressed in casual athletic wear, turned slowly, her expression unreadable, her posture relaxed. She was calm, too calm. "Excuse me," she asked, her voice steady, unfazed by his aggressive tone. McAllister stepped closer, towering over her as he barked, "You've been loitering here for a while. Show me some ID." The crowd around them began to slow, people taking notice, some already reaching for their phones. They had seen scenes like this before, where an officer assumed authority over someone who had done nothing wrong. The woman, however, didn't flinch. She didn't argue or raise her voice. She simply met his gaze and said, "Loitering? I just walked out of that store." She nodded toward the glass doors behind her, where security cameras were mounted. The officer scoffed, uninterested in details that didn't fit his narrative. "Just comply and show me some ID," he repeated, this time with an edge of irritation. The woman let out a slow breath, glancing at the people gathering around them. The moment was shifting. McAllister felt it too, and it only made him more aggressive. "What's the problem? Got something to hide?" he taunted, smirking. The woman crossed her arms, her stance still calm but now challenging. "No, I just know my rights," she said, "and I also know you don't have the right to demand my ID without cause." The crowd murmured, their attention now fully on the exchange. Someone in the back whispered, "He's messing with the wrong one." But McAllister was too blinded by arrogance to hear it. His jaw clenched as he reached for his handcuffs, his authority being tested in a way he didn't like. "I'm giving you one last chance," he threatened. "Either comply or I'll make this a lot harder for you." The woman tilted her head slightly, something almost amused flashing in her eyes. "You really don't know who you're messing with, do you?" she said quietly. McAllister scoffed. "Yeah? And who exactly am I messing with?" The air around them grew heavier, the tension thick enough to cut. The crowd leaned in, sensing that something big was about to happen. The officer smirked, still thinking he was in control. But what he didn't realize was that the woman standing before him, unshaken by his intimidation, was a highly decorated Navy SEAL. And in just a few moments, he was about to regret everything. Before we dive in, have you ever seen an abuse of power like this? Tell us in the comments and subscribe for more eye-opening stories like this. Because what happens next will leave you speechless. Jasmine Cole had spent years mastering the art of staying calm under pressure. As a Navy SEAL, she had faced life-threatening situations in hostile territories, had been trained to assess threats, and had learned how to control the battlefield with precision. But today, the battlefield wasn't a war zone. It was a bustling city street in one of the wealthiest downtown districts. She had just stepped out of a high-end boutique, her shopping bag swinging lightly at her side, when a sharp voice stopped her in her tracks. "Hey, you, hold it right there." The words came from behind, firm, laced with authority, but there was something else beneath them. Assumption. Jasmine turned to see Officer Ryan McAllister approaching, his hand resting on his belt, his stance confrontational. He was the type of cop she had seen too many times before, one who assumed before he observed, judged before he understood. He was in his early 40s, stocky with a permanent scowl etched into his face. There was no reason for him to stop her, but he had decided she was out of place. His eyes scanned her, not seeing a well-trained veteran, but a black woman, standing in a space he believed she didn't belong in. Jasmine met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "Something wrong, officer?" she asked, keeping her voice steady, her stance relaxed but firm. McAllister narrowed his eyes, already irritated that she hadn't immediately shrunk under his scrutiny. "Need to see some ID," he said gruffly. Jasmine lifted a brow. "Why?" The cop bristled, unaccustomed to being questioned. "Because I asked for it," he snapped. She tilted her head slightly, sensing his growing frustration. "And I'm asking why you need it," she said evenly. "Did I break a law? Is there a reason you're stopping me?" McAllister scoffed. "You've been standing here for a while, acting suspicious." Jasmine almost laughed. She had been in the store for the past 10 minutes, browsing, chatting with the cashier, paying for her items like any other customer. But she knew how this game worked. It didn't matter that she had done nothing wrong. To men like McAllister, her existence was reason enough. Around them, people had started to slow down, sensing something was happening. A few passers-by subtly reached for their phones, their instincts kicking in. These situations had played out before, and they knew how they usually ended. Jasmine kept her voice calm, controlled. "I just walked out of a store," she said. "You can check the security footage if you want." McAllister sneered, taking a step closer. "Don't need to check anything," he said, his fingers twitching at his belt. "Just need you to comply." Jasmine inhaled slowly, feeling the tension in the air thicken. She could see it in his eyes. He wanted this to escalate. He wanted her to argue, to raise her voice, to give him a reason to grab those cuffs at his waist. But Jasmine wasn't rattled. She had been in situations far worse than this, and unlike McAllister, she knew exactly who she was dealing with. The officer squared his shoulders, still expecting obedience. "I'm not going to ask you again," he warned. Jasmine met his gaze without fear, her voice steady. "You might want to think very carefully about what you're doing next, officer." McAllister scoffed, mistaking her warning for arrogance. "Oh, yeah? And why's that?" he taunted, completely unaware that his worst mistake had already been made. The growing crowd murmured, their eyes darting between Jasmine and the cop, sensing that something bigger was coming. And in the distance, a senior officer, Sergeant David Mitchell, had just been called to the scene, unaware that by the time he arrived it would already be too late for McAllister. The tension in the air thickened as Officer McAllister's patience ran thin. He had expected compliance, submission, not resistance and certainly not calm defiance. His jaw tightened as he reached for his baton, his voice rising for everyone to hear. "I said, get on the ground. Now." The order rang through the street, a command meant to be obeyed without question. But Jasmine Cole didn't move. She remained exactly where she stood, her expression unreadable, her body language unwavering. Around them, the murmuring in the crowd grew louder, a mix of shock, concern, and anticipation. Phones were raised, recording the confrontation from multiple angles, ensuring that whatever happened next would not go unseen. Jasmine exhaled, her voice steady but firm. "I haven't broken any law," she stated, locking eyes with McAllister, "and I'm not getting on the ground." Her refusal wasn't shouted, wasn't emotional. It was controlled, a simple declaration of fact. McAllister already on. Edge took her refusal as an open challenge. His face twisted with anger as he stepped forward, shoving her lightly but firmly in the shoulder. "Do it now, or I'll make you." A ripple of gasps spread through the onlookers. Jasmine barely moved from the push, her balance unshaken, her posture still composed. But that touch, that attempt to assert dominance, was McAllister's first mistake. Jasmine didn't flinch, didn't recoil, didn't even blink. Instead, she simply stared at him, her presence alone enough to rattle him. "I suggest you back off," she said coolly, her voice quiet enough that only he could hear, but powerful enough to send a chill down his spine. McAllister let out a short, mocking laugh, glancing toward the crowd. "Look at this," he sneered. "Another troublemaker who thinks she's above the law." He shook his head as if amused. "You people are all the same." The crowd shifted, uncomfortably, whispers spreading like wildfire. They could all feel it. This wasn't about justice. This was about power. And the man who thought he had it was about to lose it in the worst way possible. McAllister reached for his cuffs, moving fast, expecting no resistance. "Hands behind your—" But before he could finish, Jasmine moved. The crowd barely saw it happen. A single, fluid motion. 1 second, McAllister was reaching for her. The next, his wrist was twisted, his body turning involuntarily as Jasmine sidestepped him with precise efficiency. Her movements weren't violent. They were tactical, controlled, effortless. McAllister stumbled forward, thrown off balance, confusion flashing across his face. He barely had time to process what had just happened before the murmurs of the crowd turned into a chorus of gasps and hushed exclamations. Something was different about her. Jasmine took a step back, giving him space, but now the power had shifted. She hadn't raised a fist, hadn't attacked, but in a single motion, she had let him know exactly what she was capable of. And for the first time, McAllister hesitated, because he had just realized he wasn't in control anymore. McAllister's face twisted in rage as he lunged forward, determined to seize control of the situation. His pride had already taken a hit when Jasmine slipped out of his grip the first time, but now, with the growing crowd watching, recording, his ego demanded action. He wasn't about to let some random woman, some nobody, make a fool out of him. He reached for her arm again, this time with force, but Jasmine moved before he even made contact. Her body shifted with effortless precision, sidestepping his grip with a level of control that wasn't normal. It was calculated, measured, like she had done this 1,000 times before. McAllister stumbled slightly, caught off guard by her agility, and the crowd let out another gasp. He gritted his teeth and swung his other hand forward, trying to grab her, but Jasmine twisted out of reach with the ease of someone who wasn't just avoiding a scuffle. She was trained for this. The frustration in McAllister's eyes turned into something else. Unease. He hadn't even touched her, yet he was the one struggling. Jasmine, on the other hand, was perfectly composed, not a single muscle in her body tense, not an ounce of panic in her expression. She wasn't defensive, wasn't lashing out. She was simply moving with control, letting him wear himself out. The onlookers murmured in awe, the shift in power now undeniable. This wasn't an ordinary woman. Jasmine finally spoke, her voice calm, quiet, yet cutting through the chaos like steel. "You have no idea who you're messing with." McAllister let out a breathy laugh, but it sounded forced. His anger mixed with confusion, and for the first time there was hesitation in his eyes. But his pride wouldn't let him back down. "Oh, yeah," he spat, straightening himself. "And who the hell do you think you are?" Jasmine slowly reached into her jacket, moving deliberately, giving him no reason to overreact. The crowd fell completely silent as she pulled out a leather ID case and flipped it open. The moment the golden emblem caught the light, everything changed. A ripple of shocked gasps spread through the crowd as people leaned in, eyes widening in disbelief. McAllister's mouth hung open, his entire body stiffening as he read the words on her identification. His confidence cracked, his arrogance instantly replaced with panic. Jasmine held the ID up just long enough for the cameras to catch it, then slowly lowered it. Her gaze never left McAllister's face. "I'm Lieutenant Jasmine Cole," she said evenly, "United States Navy SEAL." The words hit McAllister like a freight train. His lips parted, but no sound came out. The blood drained from his face. He blinked hard, as if his mind was trying to reject what he had just heard. "You're a SEAL," he finally choked out, his voice barely above a whisper. Jasmine didn't answer. She didn't need to. The answer was already written all over his face. McAllister stumbled back instinctively, his chest rising and falling as he processed the reality of the situation. He had spent his entire career asserting dominance, using his badge as a shield, to intimidate others. But now he was the one caught off guard. The crowd's murmurs grew louder, whispers of disbelief and suppressed laughter rippling through the bystanders. People weren't afraid anymore. They were entertained. Jasmine didn't move. She stood there completely composed, her steady gaze locked onto McAllister as if she were assessing a weak opponent. There was no need for threats, no need for retaliation. Her silence alone was enough. She didn't have to prove her power. She was power. A deep voice suddenly cut through the noise. "What the hell is going on here?" The tension in the air shifted as Sergeant David Mitchell arrived, his presence commanding respect in a way McAllister never could. A seasoned officer with decades of experience, Mitchell wasn't one to act on impulse. The moment his eyes landed on Jasmine, however, his face changed. His breath hitched slightly, and his brows pulled together in realization. He knew exactly who she was. "Oh no," he muttered under his breath, his stomach sinking. His gaze darted to McAllister, who still looked frozen, his confidence crumbling by the second. McAllister saw the look on his superior's face, and his heart plummeted. Sarge," he stammered, desperation creeping into his voice. "I was just handling a—" Mitchell didn't let him finish. His jaw tightened as he turned toward Jasmine, nodding slightly in recognition. "Lieutenant Cole," he said, his voice laced with restrained regret. "I apologize for—" Jasmine lifted a hand, stopping him. "Don't apologize for him," she said coolly, her eyes flicking toward McAllister. "He made his choices." McAllister's mouth went dry. He could feel the weight of the eyes on him. The cameras still rolling, the crowd reveling in his humiliation. His hands clenched at his sides, but for the first time, he had no control. Mitchell turned back to him, his tone dropping into something dangerously low. "Step away from her now." McAllister hesitated, looking for a way out, an excuse, something. "Sarge, now." McAllister took a small step back, then another. His pulse pounded in his ears. He had made a mistake, a career-ending mistake. Jasmine exhaled lightly, her stance never changing. McAllister had spent the last few minutes trying to make her feel small, but now, he was the one shrinking. He tried to salvage the situation, scrambling for anything that might undo the damage. "Listen, I didn't know who you were," he blurted, his voice unsteady. Jasmine tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. "And if I wasn't?" she asked, her voice cold and deliberate. "What would have happened then?" McAllister had no answer, because they both knew exactly what would have happened. The crowd burst into hushed laughter, shaking their heads. They knew too. Jasmine just shook her head, a faint smirk touching her lips. She didn't have to say another word. She had already won. The weight of the moment settled heavily in the air as Sergeant Mitchell turned to McAllister, his face tight with barely contained disappointment. The younger officer stood rigid, shoulders squared, fists clenched, but everyone could see the cracks forming in his demeanor. His arrogance had been stripped away, leaving only a man who had just realized he'd destroyed his own career. "You just tried to arrest a decorated Navy SEAL for existing in public," Mitchell said, his voice dangerously low. "Do you have any idea how badly you've screwed up?" His words cut through the street like a blade, sharp and final. McAllister opened his mouth, but nothing came out. What could he possibly say? The crowd around them erupted into murmurs, then applause. Justice, finally, in real time. A few people laughed outright, shaking their heads at the sheer absurdity of it all. Jasmine didn't need to gloat. She didn't need to say another word. She had already won. Without a backward glance, she turned and walked away, the tension dissipating in her wake. No argument, no fight, no aggression. Just quiet, absolute victory. The crowd parted for her, like waves against a rock, people watching her with newfound respect, some still recording as McAllister stood frozen in place, his face red with humiliation. His mind replayed her words on a loop. Never assume you know who you're dealing with. And now he never would again. Jasmine strode down the sidewalk, her pace relaxed, her expression unreadable. This wasn't the first time she had faced a situation like this, and it likely wouldn't be the last. But this time, she had done more than just defend herself. She had exposed something larger. She hadn't fought him with violence. She had fought him with truth. A soft voice broke her thoughts. "Excuse me, miss?" She turned to see a young woman, early 20s, mixed race, eyes wide with admiration. She looked down for a moment, almost nervous, then back up at Jasmine. I just wanted to say thank you," she said, "for standing up to him, for not backing down. She hesitated, inhaling sharply. I've been in situations like that before, and I never knew what to do. I just let it happen. Jasmine studied her for a moment, then gave her a small, knowing smile. You're not alone, she said gently. The woman swallowed hard, nodding. I won't be next time, she whispered. Jasmine placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, then stepped back. Before turning to leave, she left the woman with just one final lesson. Control isn't about power, she said. It's about knowing when to use it. And with that, she disappeared into the city, leaving behind a lesson that wouldn't be forgotten. Not by the crowd, not by McAllister, not by anyone who had witnessed the moment a man with a badge learned that true power doesn't come from a uniform. It comes from respect. McAllister stood frozen, his body tense, his mind racing as he watched Jasmine walk away, unbothered, untouched, and completely in control. The weight of his actions pressed down on him, heavier than the badge on his chest. The crowd didn't cheer anymore. They simply watched him, shaking their heads, some smirking, others recording, capturing his humiliation forever. He could feel their judgment, the unspoken realization hanging in the air. He wasn't the powerful one here. Jasmine never looked back. She didn't need to. She had already made her point without raising her voice, without throwing a punch. Her presence alone had dismantled the false authority McAllister thought he had. He had walked into this confrontation believing he controlled the narrative, but now he finally understood. Authority doesn't make you powerful. Respect does. This officer thought he could abuse his power until he met someone who had more. If this happened to you, how would you have handled it? Have you ever been unfairly targeted, judged, or profiled? Share your experiences in the comments below. Your voice matters, and if you believe in exposing injustice, holding those in power accountable, and standing up for what's right, subscribe for more powerful stories like this. Together, we can make a difference.